Just a quick check-in, keep it close.
Yep.
So everyone can hear you. We've got some
Great.
friends on Zoom as well.
Hi, Zoom.
So today we're going to have a little mix of slides and video and conversation. Hey, Tish, good to see you. Let's see, where can we find a seat for Tish, please?
There's a little hassock. There's a little hassock.
Peach
right here.
Melba's available. She's my favorite. Yes. They're so cozy. Plus, I'm from Georgia, so anything that's peach, it's almost like it's in our DNA to say, yay. All right. So let's go ahead and dive in. I think as I was thinking through what I was curious about with this, I realized that I use the word tech to refer to a bunch of stuff. So, and it can get confusing. How do you all define tech specifically within this political sphere? Like, what are you all talking about when we're talking about political tech?
Sure. It's a great question, because I do think the word tech, especially in this city, but everywhere, opens up so many different definitions and associations with that word. A lot of times when people say tech, they're talking about big tech, right? Like the large, multinational corporations have some problematic privacy policies, et cetera. And that's come to encompass a lot of people's feelings about tech overall. But at its core, for me, when I'm thinking about tech, it's lines of code and what you build with it, right? And what you build around that, whether it's civic tech tools, the technology that's used by nonprofit organizations, the technology that's harnessed by political campaigns, the data associated with that. So it's really just kind of the raw materials, right? And then what we do with it, what policies guide that, what ethics or values guide that, is up to us to collectively create, ideally. And so in the political tech world specifically, a lot of, when I talk about political tech, it's about specifically the tools that are used by campaigns and organizations to reach out to voters, to counter misinformation, to leverage data for better analytics and forecasts of how to organize campaigns, and a lot more that we'll get into in a second. But sometimes it's helpful to kind of start there when we talk about the tools that are in the political tech tool set.
Excellent. Would you like to add anything, Andy?
I think maybe I have a different. I can't describe it that cogently. I think for me, tech is about distribution, and so because I started off in business and analog businesses for the first few decades of my working career, then I saw something which had massive distribution. And so because I'm trying to concentrate on reaching the most people and change the most behavior, the most positive behavior possible for the lowest cost, I look at any kind of system that is within this highly scalable distribution system that will work as, I guess I'd call it tech, but I think I just call it, that's what I want to do. So does that make sense?
It does.
Yep.
It is an interesting perspective, because I think one of the things that has come up, particularly around the conversation of why some people feel tech is bad, is the reach, the distribution. And so, old school, like, what did they have? Chicago style politics, if you will, where the machine sends people out to knock on the doors and do everything. Like, you can have a huge machine with, even thousands of people, but they can't make the same number of connections, just surely.
Yeah, you got to keep your values up. That's hard to do. Yeah.
Oh, we will come back to that one. Okay, so we kind of already touched on this, and so just to officially put it out there, I think it goes without saying that technology's reputation has taken a bit of a hit. A few congressional hearings, a few too many Mark Zuckerberg sightings in a suit. He looks so uncomfortable. It's insane. A few senators talking about Finsta instead of Insta, and asking for the congressional record what that is. Kind of embarrassing for them. What do you all see as the problems? Like, what has led up to the reputational hit? And is the criticism fair? Andy, why don't you take that one first?
Well, yeah, I think the criticism is totally fair. I mean, we might be in a bad situation even if the tech didn't, or if the digital part of it didn't exist. I mean, these things are driven by capital markets and shareholder return, and there's not a lot of value checks on the system. And so, and the value checks have been on the margins. So, and there's, the way that just people think the technology has been designed for one person to be in front of a screen at a time. That's 98% of the usage, really. And so it's a very lonely, solipsistic, siloed existence. I mean, it's in some ways it's worse than your family sitting around watching a television. That you're all alone when you're watching the tech, and it's easy for all sorts of nefarious forces to abuse that, or just capital forces to abuse that in the interests of profit.
Hillary?
Yeah, I would say there are a couple components that are why the criticism is there. If you look at here in San Francisco, the early 2000s was, kind of the tech boom V1, for those of us who were here. And then in the, 2010s to 2015, if we call that tech boom too, there were a lot of ideologies that accompanied a fairly homogenous group of people. It's mostly, kind of your straight white cis, hoodie wearing dude, kind of like, and it was very, move fast, break things, fast startup culture. Now, there are a lot of parts of moving quickly and pivoting and being flexible and changing in response to circumstances. There are a lot of good things in those behaviors, but I do think some of the components of moving quickly for a product that scaled and took on just such a massive role in society at large. And the ideology didn't shift to take on more social responsibility as quickly as the companies took a more significant role in society. And so a lot of those early ideologies remained fairly naive as to how they could be abused. And there were a lot of profits that accompanied that. So there were very few incentives for that ideology to change until now, several years in, we've seen the significance of the consequences of that on society, on the mental health of teens, on the intense decrease of trust in our democratic processes, in no small part to election interference by foreign powers abusing these platforms. And we realize, a little too late, right? That there should have been a shift to the move fast, break things way sooner. That didn't happen. And I think we're in a moment of reckoning for that. And that's showing a lot of the lack of matched understanding of how these technology platforms function, the basics of kind of tech company profit structures are not shared by members of Congress who are responsible for legislating a lot of those, right? And I think a lot of people are worried, how do we legislate our way out of this problem or enact policy? But there are a lot of people who worked at these companies very early on who've become some of the most vocal proponents for practical changes that could be adopted by larger corporations or larger tech corporations to be more socially responsible in their work. And so I'm pleased to see that there are people who are taking that responsibility and putting solutions forward.
It's interesting, the convergence of, great idea, hustle, capitalism leads to hot mess. And now a few years after the fact, the realization of, okay, we got to start digging our way out.
But I think just for perspective, if you're here and you didn't read the bios, I think it's significant that you have venture capital firms that are investing in, they want a 10 times return or whatever, and they're looking, and tech is, juicy for doing that. But I just think it's important that Hillary is running, or is one of the managers of a fund, a venture fund, which is investing in socially responsible tech. Most of those companies are it's for profit, but profit's not the only thing which is guiding their investments, and they're investing on the political left in tech. So I just think Hillary's got a big, broad kind of view over lots of different solutions to trying to do this well, and I've just got one. just for context about kind of yeah, I think it helps understand the comments.
Yes.
Yeah.
The self-deprecation there. That was a great segue.
really
Thank
great.
you. So if we could go ahead and put up the slides. So Hillary, Andy literally just did my job for me. Thank you. But tell us a little bit about Higher Ground Labs, how it came about, and yes, what it means to be a hub for stakeholders in political technology.
Sure. So Higher Ground Labs was founded in late 2016 after the disastrous results of the US election. Show McDonough and Betsy Hoover, both Obama campaign veterans, got together and decided to take responsibility for solving the digital gap that had unfolded in 2016. Anybody here volunteer for the Obama campaign? Either one? Thank you. Remember the good old days? But in the Obama years, the campaigns were known for better leveraging big data and having a more strategic digital first approach to campaigning that was really revolutionary for the time. But then I think the other side caught up and kind of passed us, right? And so in 2016, there was a big gap in digital campaigning savvy and strategy, along with some other challenges that I think Democrats need to take very seriously and still solve. And digital, was a big one in 2016. So kind of in response to that and realizing that there was kind of a gap in the space of tools and new resources that were available for campaigns of all sizes, from presidential down to city council, that could benefit from a greater set of affordable, accessible, easy to use tool sets, everything from data to analytics to voter contact tools. And so they raised a fund to start investing in startups that were building new solutions that could help bridge this gap. And so Higher Ground Labs since then has invested over $30 million in 60 plus startups building tools to take on a range of these challenges. But we don't just kind of, give a founder, a 100K check and say, good luck, right? We recognize that there has to be a lot more that goes into building technology, especially in this space, that allows those tools to be driven by the right values that grow in an ethical and smart way and meet the needs of a very important and very unique ecosystem, right? Like the funds that are available in an election year are very different than what happens in an off cycle. So how do you build a sustainable business, right, that's around for the next cycle? So there's a lot of additional support and unique circumstances that need to be addressed for effective technology innovation and political tech. So Higher Ground Labs really stretches to partner with campaigns, the committees, advocacy organizations, both to understand what the needs are, to collect feedback, and to collectively source and bring those forward. So that's our spoke. We also, if anybody here is job searching anytime soon, we have great partners with a group called All Hands, which currently has over 1,600 open roles in political technology, everything from sales, marketing, product ops to design, product, and coding. And if anybody's tired of working at any of the big companies and getting slack from your friends at happy hour and want to go join a campaign and build the next tools, please talk to us. We need you. And we also help with some other initiatives that do things like security sprints, reliability sprints. User accessibility is really important because volunteers on political campaigns are as diverse and reflective of the unique populations across the US as they should be. And so the tools need to work for all types of volunteers, not just those of us who live in San Francisco. So we work on a number of those different pieces. And then could we flick to the next slide, please? Thanks. So here's our portfolio of companies. You might recognize some of these, including Mobilize. If anybody here has signed up for volunteer shifts or organizing efforts on Mobilize America, they've been one of our real standouts. A number of relational organizing tools, and I think we'll talk about relational organizing more in a little bit, along with some other voter outreach tools. And some really neat creative companies, just everything you can imagine. It's really nice and it's a privilege to be able to help support people in conceptualizing a solution that could help bridge some of these big divides and disengagement and really activate those and get those into the bloodstream of campaigns and organizations.
So Hillary, can you maybe pick one of the companies, maybe one that you've been directly involved in, and tell us their story? And what they're doing and how they're defining their success.
Sure. Well, it's so hard. I love all my children equally. But to highlight one that I think is really yeah, I'll Good Stock is awesome. So they were in our accelerator last year. Good Stock was started by a veteran, a woman who was a major organizer on the Obama campaign and a longtime DC political operative. So just really unique set of experiences. And they're building a next level one-stop shop for campaign swag. You know, in 2016 and 2020, those damn red hats are everywhere, right? And we did this one study a long time ago about yard signs. And then, like ever since then, any campaign swag has been a little bit almost taboo, because there was a study that yard signs weren't effective in like a particular place in one particular cycle. And so I think people kind of moved away from the importance of swag. And frankly, the other side really beat us on that, right? They found so much community and unity and strength in numbers by having a visual signaler, that they weren't alone, right? And what's our answer to that on the other side? In the 2020 race, we had like a great fly swatter that came out of the vice presidential debate. We had a couple other pieces, but there's a lot of room for us to grow with swag. And instead of burdening campaigns with designing, producing a physical item, shipping that, navigating the complexity of sales tax around campaign merch sales, like I won't bore you, it's complicated. This is a great space for technology to come in and say, hey, there's really efficient ways for us to build a platform that solves that. You focus on the campaign, set up your shop with us, and then boom, here's your blue hats or whatever it is that we come up with, that just takes that burden out of the campaign and is a great place for tech to come in and make it much more efficient, but ultimately make us more visible, more powerful, and more unified in our strength in numbers by having those physical signalers.
And so you said that you all essentially invest in these organizations, but also in time with candidates and working on the campaigns. How have candidates and I guess the party officials, how have they responded to this seemingly exponential growth in political tech?
Yeah. Oh, and wait till you see the next slide.
I love your excitement. Oh my gosh. You really do love all your children equally.
So if you thought that was a lot of logos, look at this. So you need a magnifying glass to see this. So something that Higher Ground Labs does every year is a landscape report. And this is something that's common in venture capital firms. You really look at an overall marketplace and all of the players that are building tools or active companies in that space to understand where there are gaps, needs, opportunities, and then that guides your investment thesis. The political technology space, since 2016 has really exploded. There's so many startups that are here. So I think campaign officials, there's a little bit of overwhelm where people say, wow, there's a lot of companies out there. Like, how do we choose them? What do we need? But I think a bigger sentiment is relief. Where people really feel like the needs and the feedback that they've been surfacing have been identified. And we're starting to bring good quality, integration first, smart, accessible tools at good price points that solve those problems. And so
the HGL landscape report is totally available. It's online. You can go home. You can curl up in bed with it tonight. It's really it's really well written. It's really well written.
Thanks.
Yeah. So so I love it.
So Andy, have you curled up in bed with?
I do curl up in bed with the HGL landscape report. Yeah.
You have really shared a lot tonight. I just want you to know. Okay, so that is amazing. And you're right. From this distance, even at that size, my eyes are twitching. But I think it's important to understand the other side is presumably engaged in the same activity. You all have invested since 2016, you said around $30 million. Do you have any idea of the numbers on the right of center?
I'm not sure. Shortly after Higher Ground Labs launched, the right launched their own version called Startup Caucus. And they do have a similar innovation accelerator program. My understanding, I don't spend a lot of time, because I'm like, who has time for that? But, there's a little bit less acceptance of new tech on the other side. But at the same time, they were faster to to innovate on a model of data exchange between the party and state parties. And we ended up modeling, a different version of kind of a similar way of changing data exchange. So I think it really does vary. Like both parties will always borrow from and copy from each other, but I think we have a pretty good head start on modernizing the marketplace.
Excellent. And so from your vantage point as basically a VC in this space, what are some of the challenges that are still being faced? Like clearly a slow start, but it's going, it seems like it's pretty nimble, but what are some things that are still concerning to you?
Yeah, I think, when you're trying to build a sustainable business, the boom bust cycle of elections is tricky, right? And so part of what we wanted to build was long-term infrastructure so that companies could survive in the years when there's not a lot of elections and still keep their business going, keep their staff, paid. So I do think the uneven revenue cycles are challenging. There's still a lot of money that goes into TV and ads, right? And so part of what we're trying to carve out is more and demonstrating evidence of more efficient voter outreach and effects from digital ads and organizing technology to carve out more of the budget for tech and organizing and showing that there's some efficiency and positive results for doing that. I think with elections, it's, there's kind of one outcome each cycle. And so there's still a little bit of resistance to take on a lot of new risks and try new things because people don't want to fail and lose when there's so much at stake. That said, I think people recognize that the world around us has changed so significantly just in the last few cycles that we have to adopt these new models. And our whole mission is to just make that easier. But I think that and affordability and really outreach, making sure that there's tools, not just for the top of the ticket, but local campaigns also have access to easy to use tools, even if they don't have as big of a budget or as much staff for their campaigns, that they're still able to get some of these benefits from innovation.
And then just one more question before we pivot. So these different companies are creating tools for campaigns. Are the tools also available, say, for issue organizations? Like, can Planned Parenthood also benefit from these?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's been amazing to see how the tools can, in moments of crisis, a lot of the companies in our portfolio and beyond will grant free use of tools in these moments of crisis. So when there were the Hurricane Harvey floods in Texas, a lot of internet was out, but SMS was still working. And so the peer-to-peer SMS companies like Hustle granted free use of the tool for unions to actually reach out in Texas to make sure that people got rescues or supplies that they needed during shelter in place. When the road decision linked, companies like Impactive, which is a relational organizing and broadcast texting tool, granted up to $10,000 in free use of the tool for repro rights organizations. And a lot of the advocacy organizations are the ones that are going year round. And so we end up being the longest term partners for a lot of these tools with the advocacy groups with these big spikes in electoral cycles.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So now we're going to shift perspective to what's it like to be one of those companies in the midst of this space. So Andy, tell us a little bit about Feel Good Action, and then we will play the video.
Okay. Well, just in the interests of full disclosure here, so we're not an HGL company. We're a nonprofit. We're 501c3, but Betsy Hoover, who Hillary was talking about, who worked in the Obama administration, is on our board. And so that's our connection. But there is when we use actually some HGL companies as vendors that support us. So I think, just going back to the yard sign for a second, and about why would yard signs be effective in a political campaign? And there's a lot of the work that I do is based on behavioral science and kind of one of the pioneers of this, Albert Bandura here at Stanford University, did this famous experiment of people in a room, 10 people in a room, bowling ball and a ping pong ball. And the first person is asked, which is bigger? And they hold up the ping pong ball and they say, this is bigger. And they pass them to the next person. And that person says, the ping pong ball is bigger. And this goes around the table and it continues until it gets to the 10th person, who is the only specimen or the only test subject in the room, because the first 9 people are plants. They're actually graduate students of Albert Bandura. And 92% of the time, the 10th person says the ping pong ball is bigger. And so what Bandura was really fascinated on and kind of developed this notion of the objective fallacy, which is that most of us in politics and in science think that if I just explained the issue to you, you would agree with me. And in fact, what behavioral psychology proves time and time again is that all of us, the fact that we're at Manny's, the clothes we're wearing, the car we're driving, where we live, who we're voting for, is really based on social constructs and the amplification and the way we get new ideas is also kind of well documented about how new ideas break into these social networks. So I was an entrepreneur, and I read about a media intervention in Tanzania, and I saw this thing and I did a life pivot because they were broadcasting a show in Tanzania, and in the places they broadcast this show, use of birth control went up 150%. And in the places where the show wasn't broadcast, it was flat. And so I was like, I'm doing this the rest of my life. And I sold my businesses, and I really got into this also around the same cycle that Hillary's talking about. You know, in 2016, 100 million, Hillary got 63 million, Trump got 62 million and won the Electoral College. 100 million people didn't vote. That was the biggest block of the US electorate. Many of them, most of them, were below 34 years old. So the genesis of this is really thinking, well, how do you use behavior science to turn on this massive number of people who are not voting? It's a massive, massive number, much bigger than the margin of victory in most races. So we could play this video, or we could skip past this video and I can just keep going. I don't know, Angelina, whatever you want to do here. I'm good if you know how to skip past that. We
To the
save a little.
TikToks?
What's that?
To the TikToks?
Well, I just want to show people, I don't know if you can see this. You know, we really spend a lot of time going after these 3 segments out there because these 3 segments, young women, young Black and brown people, young people of color, and young LGBTQIA, when they do show up to vote, they vote overwhelmingly toward our values, and our values we're very transparent about. We put them up on our website. So we spend most of our time turning these folks on, and we use social media micro-influencers to do this because they're in a community of social media micro-influencers, and we use tracking codes called UTMs. And I'm just wondering, do people already know what UTMs are? Some people, okay. So maybe what I think—
I appreciate that vigorous head
yeah,
shake.
that vigorous
no.
head shake. So let's, you know, I mentioned this, and this is just like, if you look at Georgia there, you have a race, Purdue and Ossoff, you know, won by less than 55,000 votes. 1.2 million people in Georgia fit that description that I just said, below 34, women, people of color, that are not voting. So 20 times the amount of the margin of victory. And so we are really going after that with behavior science. So I just wanted to show how we're tracking. And let's see, let's go to the next slide, and let's just you just click every 3 seconds and I'll keep up. And so if you take one of our users who's not registered, you know, we call this person Kali. She's in Phoenix. She cares a lot about climate and about other issues, but she's not voting. And she's spending a lot of time on social media. Just keep going here a little faster. And she's clicking around with her mouse hand. And she goes to an influencer on social media called Maya. And we partner with Maya. Our journey at Feel Good Action, we start with Maya. She has a high engagement rating, and she has 38,000 people, most of whom are in that core demographic. And we post with her, and we get her to when she posts, we get her to put this code. It's kind of hard to see, but in the upper right-hand corner, there's this UTM code, and we get her to put that in her bio. So when somebody clicks on the link, when Holly clicks on the link, it follows her. You can see Thank you. It's following her into our registration tool. She's registering to vote. And we know that Kali came from Maya. We know that that's the network that's turning her on. And so when Kali finishes that, she's automatically going to the Secretary of State site in Arizona, and she's finishing her registration there, and she's going into our cloud database. And then we can start to directly contact her, not through the influencer anymore, with texting and with email. But the important thing is that in our world, and we think in most people's worlds, only 3 or 4% of what is going up in social media and going up on the internet in general is actually causing activation. Validation of your registration, getting an absentee ballot, all of the behaviors that are necessary to vote. And so unless you know that, unless you know what is the effective part, you really are just kind of like throwing confetti out of an airplane, you know? So we are very obsessed with what is the message and what is the messenger? Who's the messenger that is creating that activation? So
Andy, very quickly, tell us why, because you were very specific that Maya has 38,000 followers. Why, like, how do you all define the influencers that you target?
Yeah, so there are influencer directories, you know, just basically like Airbnb when you're looking for your vacation house. There are influencer directories who list, you know, corporate America has built these things for the most part. And maybe some of you in this room work for companies that make those directories. And so you can find influencers. If you want to sell Coca-Cola, you can find influencers who are going to be, you know, reach a certain demographic. And we're using those tools to find people who have a strong audience in our core groups. Whatever we're finding are people who are going to vote for the candidates and for the policies that we're looking for. And most of the time that has to do with young women, young LGBTQ, and young people of color. We tend to stay away from young white men. I used to be one, so I have some sympathy. But young white men, especially in the middle of the country, they sometimes break, you know, 50-50, sometimes they break against our values. So we kind of just don't get the same margins with them. So did I answer the question?
Not exactly,
okay.
but no worries. So with that target, so young people under 35, Black and brown, LGBTQIA. To my mind, if you were trying to reach those groups, you would reach out and connect with, say, Beyonce, Gaga, like we had earlier. Why Maya over Gaga?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There's actually an inverse relationship statistically in behavior science between the number of followers you have and your ability to change normative behavior, deep-rooted behaviors. So Lady Gaga is really good at telling people that there's a new iPhone because it's just information. And so if you already know what an iPhone is and you use an iPhone and you're going to buy a new iPhone eventually, then that information can come across with somebody who has tons of, but if you want to change normative behavior, you know, if you want to ask somebody to stop eating meat or to give up their car and take public transportation, or not to have children, then the most effective influencer in that person's life is your family, your next door neighbor, the people you work with, the people who are closest to you, who you have a bond with, a human bond with. And this is kind of gets full circle back to your question about what's wrong with digital is, and what do we call this bond that of people who don't have followers? This is what we call relational organizing. You know, we've come up with this word for it, but really that's what it is. It's just friends talking to friends about what's important to them. So there is this inverse relationship. And on the spectrum between your next door neighbor and Lady Gaga, in the middle of that, there's a micro influencer who has a pretty big following, but people feel like, I know this person, I'm intimate with this person. They actually responded once when I posted a comment. And so that's kind of why we because we're interested in scale, we inject our behavior science there.
And so what is the impact that you all like with the last election around 2020? What did you all see?
Yeah, so let's go ahead one slide and see. This is this is the dashboard, which is way too hard to see, but let's go to the next slide, that bottom, that right there. So this is just daily activations of people who are clicking in and doing those behaviors. That bar on the right, on the far right, which goes over 1,000 registrations that day, that is the Supreme Court decision on abortion. And so,
Damn.
salience matters, headline news matters. And unfortunately, I think one thing which has happened with digital tech, one of the problems is that the attention span for important issues is not really sustained very long. Right now, we're seeing, and you probably are seeing in your own networks, that there's just not as much conversation about reproductive rights. It's just gone down. That doesn't mean that people necessarily feel it less, but they're talking about it less, and there's less activation around it. So one of the things we have is we have a rapid response team, and we try to ride the wave of salience. And unfortunately, there's no better time to talk about climate change than when there's a fire that's on the news. And there's no better time to talk about, preventing gun violence than right after a massacre. And we just saw that. We just saw historic legislation, right? Not exactly what we all hoped for, but we saw some legislation after a massacre. And so action does follow. And we are right now, one of the things we try to do is be the silver cloud, the silver lining on dark, bad shit. Yeah.
And there's so much of
There
that
is
to
so much
work
of that,
through.
Yeah.
All right. So I want to zone back out and then make a pivot to you all for your questions. And hope that child is okay.
Yeah.
Oh, in the back. Oh my gosh. I thought it was
Yeah.
someone outside.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll liven it up. I promise. So, Hillary, you mentioned about television, and that's still getting the lion's share of money. And there are still, to your point, Andy, about relational mobilizing, there's still people who are doing door to door, like the knocking. We've had candidates come through and tell us about the thousands of doors they've knocked on and the neighbors they've met. And I know during the 2020 election, the Democrats were like, we've got a pandemic, friends, and we trust science. So stay at home and Zoom. But a lot of candidates were frustrated by that. Do you feel like, or how do you see political tech intersecting and working with old school canvassing and with TV? And I still hear people talk about radio ads, which is so weird. I'm like, I thought we were all streaming now, but hey. And is this something that will overtake those old school approaches?
Yeah, I love zooming out to this part of the conversation because it comes back to the tech is really the tools that we are using now to do what we've always done for organizing. Are any Marshall Gans fans? Oh, great. Okay. Yeah. So Marshall Gans was a student at MIT, dropped out during the farm workers movement to organize alongside Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, and then went back and applied an academic lens to studying the, like anthropologically almost, the structure of successful social movements. And out of that, he still teaches a course at the Harvard Kennedy School about organizing. And it's always going to be different because every community is different, but there are some formulas that last throughout the context. A lot of it's around connecting and building a relationship with someone around shared values, and then leveraging that relationship for an ask. The ask is in service of a goal, a shared goal to achieve an objective that meets those values. And there's a component of storytelling and public narrative. And so if you go back through a number of candidate speeches, usually they'll start out with a personal story about where they grew up or something. And it really lets you in through a story about who that person is and the values that you have, that you share with them. And so the relationship begins, right? And we've been doing this at door stoops and on porches for decades. Now, some of the relationships that we build are online, and we have had to leverage new tools and find new ways to build those same relationships, which is why I'm really excited about relational and influencer organizing, because how do we scale authentic relationships using technology without losing something is an important question. It's a lifelong curiosity that I have. Authenticity is a big part of it. So if somebody is willing to strum a guitar for 38,000 followers, there's a component of vulnerability and authenticity that's really important for trust. And so much trust has been lost. And the acceleration of loss in trust digitally has happened exponentially faster than it would happen for most of our in-person interactions. But I do think there's a component of adapting to building those relationships and building trust digitally that's really important. And we were forced to do that in the pandemic. So a lot of the tools that we were early experiments with became core to the campaign strategy because we didn't have the same access to door stoops and canvassing in front of the grocery store that we usually do. So it was really interesting to see what happened. And while I am not the biggest fan of TV and radio ads, there are still studies that are incredibly effective when you look at turnout compared to some of the other newer tools that we're using. So we can't just, stop lighting money on fire for TV ads at this moment, unfortunately, just yet. But I think the next most effective thing, and a lot of the studies have been done, were relational. And I would put influencer outreach as part of that. So we're starting to see some of the biggest gains in new tech leveraging voter turnout be in this relational space, which I love because it really just gets back to this old school component of relationships.
And it can be augmented. It can be augmented by the technology. One of the HDL companies that you saw on the screen earlier, Impactive, is that you can bring up, if you have the app on your phone, the Impactive app, you can enter an area code. You can enter an area code in Wisconsin. You can enter 4 or 5 area codes in Wisconsin, and you'll see all the people that are in your contact list who are not registered to vote in Wisconsin. Well, this is really strong if you give it, because Michigan people, they know people in Wisconsin, their family members live in Wisconsin, but so you can contact them right there through the app. And then later on, if you can get those people, you message them and say, hey, I'm working on, the election. It's really important to me. I'm trying to, safeguard women's rights. Then actually Impactive can report back to you about how successful you were as an activist, just doing relational. And that kind of those shortcuts to relational haven't really been in place. I think it's a fantastic integration of those, of the human to human, leveraging the real authentic relationship, but kind of doing the scorekeeping with technology. Yeah.
Well said. Yeah.
It's interesting because you all may remember, was it the 2018 or 2018, the AOC Connor Lamb.
Good year. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was kind of the precursor of Impactive, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Wasn't it?
Yeah, it was Outvote at that time.
Yeah, and then it became Reach.
Yeah.
Reach?
Separate tool, but
Oh,
same
okay.
kind of gist.
Okay, yeah.
But Outvote became Impactive in part because they didn't want to just be focused on voter turnout, but using relationships for all types of action year round.
Excellent. So my last question is really the question that we posed at the beginning of this conversation. Can tech save democracy? I like to keep the small ones for the end.
Well, I think people have to save democracy. Tech's not going to do it by itself. And I don't know. I'm the kind of person who, if the ship is going down, I'm going to be bailing water till I'm dead. So I don't know really the answer to it. I do think that massive behavior change is necessary in this country and around the globe. And I think that if you get the media right, that it becomes the lowest cost, most scalable means of massive behavior change.
Awesome. Hillary?
I think in some ways it depends on if you're an optimist.
Mhm.
I'm a very disciplined optimist. It's just my kind of coping strategy for the past couple of years. It's worked out okay. But it reminds me a lot of the metaphor art imitating life, imitating art. And I think a lot of ways tech plays a similar reflective role where tech can imitate our culture and our culture can imitate what tech gives us. We need to get strategic about the points of intervention, and those interventions need to be inclusive and values-based. There's definitely some legwork we need to figure out for the big tech companies around what's the role of a private corporation in articulating policies that include values, or should those be national policies or international policies? privacy, there's a number of components there. When it comes to political tech, I feel very optimistic that these tools are just an extension of the work that people do to connect with each other and accomplish more together than we can accomplish alone every day. So I feel very optimistic for that, with a lot of asterisks around privacy and security and ethics. But ultimately, I think the tools are what we make of them. Can I help like co-facilitate for one little piece though? Because
Absolutely.
just zooming out to a little bit of a global view, there's somebody here who's using tech to help protect democracy in Ukraine. And I was wondering if
Oh
he
my
could.
gosh, why didn't you tell us this from the beginning? Oh my
And
goodness.
I was wondering, Corey, could you share a few words about what you're doing? Because I feel like it's probably the best, most optimistic answer to this question. And so,
Yeah.
okay, bring him in.
Do you mind coming up so our Zoomers can see you
For
as
sure.
well?
How close do I need
The
to be?
Zoom fam.
About here?
Yeah.
Oh, are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Hillary.
By the way, these are excellent shoes.
Thank you.
Oh, those are
Those
great.
are very cool.
Thank
Okay,
you.
that is totally not relevant, but very important to me. Okay,
I got them from out of the closet in Nob Hill.
what?
Like $20.
Oh my gosh, we're going off topic back.
Anyway,
Back.
I'm also from South Carolina, so we should connect.
What?
So my name is Corey Alpert. I come from a political background. I was one of the regional chiefs of staff on the Pete Buttigieg campaign, was with the Hillary Clinton campaign. Like that's, I sort of come from that world. The last few months, I've been working pretty closely in Ukraine. I spent a good bit of time in June in Kyiv. And so I'm advising a nonprofit foundation that's building a lot of the technology that is helping the Ukrainians. So one part of that is our humanitarian assistance platform. Another huge part of that is a platform that we call civic. If anyone speaks Ukrainian, that means witness. So it's the technology that's undergirding the war crimes investigations. So we're verifying, collating, and disseminating evidence to the American, British, and Ukrainian war crimes prosecutors. Although if anyone saw the news this morning, the main prosecutor was just fired for having connections with the Russian government. So that's been fun, but we're in connection with the entire prosecutorial office. And then another huge part of what we're doing is we're leveraging all these relationships, and with the blessing of the Zelensky administration, we're building the rebuilding report for the Ukrainians. And so a huge part of what I'm focusing on, what I'm chairing, is rebuilding democracy in Ukraine. So what does that look like to rebuild trust in the democratic process in the aftermath of a war, specifically out in the Donbass? So we're thinking a lot about this, and we're using a lot of the tools that you've been talking about and that you've been thinking about, but in some different contexts. How do we, in the US, we have a very established, firm democracy. As we're about to see in Ukraine, it's a democracy that very much is under threat, that could go the way of what we think of as Soviet democracy, where like it was a democracy for like 5 years, and then Putin decided it wasn't going to be a democracy anymore. And so how do we build that? How do we rebuild trust in these institutions? How do we engage technology? And what's really exciting is like there's opening for this in Ukraine. There's an agency called DIA, where people are engaging and like they're voting on the new post stamps. So like, am I allowed to curse up here?
Yes, we do it all the time.
So like I stood in line for like 4 hours for the Russian warship "Go fuck yourself" stamps that the Ukrainians voted on, and it's the soldier like showing the middle finger to that warship, and like they're engaged with that on these apps and in Telegram, and it's a big part of Ukrainian culture, and there's an Office of Digital Transformation, but so I think it's going to be a big part of like how do we engage technology in one, like the actual structure of democracy there, but in people's attitudes toward democracy and towards government. So really exciting opportunities, and can't wait to continue. I'm going to have lots and lots of conversations with you on how we engage a lot of HDL folks and who's able to do that, but excited for that prospect.
What I'd like to do is something a little different. Go ahead and stay. I'll trade mics with you if you can pick that one up. Andy, you come and take my seat, and I'll walk around for audience questions. Yeah. So we have all three of them up here.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for coming up here.
No, thank you.
Okay.
And while we're getting settled here, I just want to also just say thanks to Precious, who I just want to say thanks to Precious, who we were just chatting, and I said we should do an evening on political tech, and she was like, "Oh yeah, people would like that." So yeah, it was great. Felt super easy to read.
All right, who wants, there we go. Okay, come here. And I'm gonna get my steps in today. All right, I'll hold the mic for you.
Sure. Hi, my name is Danny. I am, it's actually fun to be in community because I also run a civic tech nonprofit called the Center for New Data. And we use big data analytics to measure long lines at polling locations across the country. I wanted to ask about the balance of how particularly civic tech organizations, who they work with. I had talked to Betsy and Shamik, maybe a year ago as we were first getting started. And one of the things I found very interesting is one of the data vendors we were working with was a data vendor that sells their data to all types of people working in the political space. And they suggested that we switch to another vendor who only works with progressive groups. And that really large diagram that you put up, I'm curious, what is the proportion of groups operating in the space who have these litmus tests for who they work with versus organizations that a pure capitalist model, they'll work with anyone?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And it's one of the most unique things about the political technology marketplace is the marketplace has really driven side picking, right? And I do think that in some ways it's an unfortunate reflection of the level of polarization in our and overall mistrust. But when people's lives are at stake, you can't really mess around, right? And so it's a market-driven preference that I think functions for the time being for the majority of the space. Most of the major, I think all of the major political technology providers that serve the political tech market first and foremost are on one side or the other. And a lot of that is because the startups partner so closely with the campaigns and advocacy organizations. Why would Sierra Club provide all this product feedback to make the tool really good so that like Shell could use it, right? There just wouldn't be the right type of partnership since the tools are so closely co-created by partners in the political tech world. But I think once you get into the bigger tech companies, there's just kind of, a different vibe or different approach. But I'd say it's actually, in the past 5 years, it's probably the majority of the space really serves one side or the other. And companies that try to be open to both, there's a lot of market pressure for them and they lose clients unless they ultimately adopt a value statement and turn away conservative clients.
I would say also that the investors of HGL are not necessarily expecting the same returns that they would get if they were at a traditional VC. And so why would they do that? They would do that because they feel like they're getting something else out of it. So I think your investors are expecting you to invest in and have a value system. I don't know. I know some of your investors and it just seems that way to me. But, yeah.
They're great. I think, if you want a unicorn, like political tech's probably not like your spot, right?
Yeah.
But if you want to have a significant impact and instead of, only doing a campaign contribution that one time, one cycle, could you look at what you're investing in building long-term infrastructure that benefits way more campaigns down the line and across cycles, right? And so is there an efficiency that's driven through some of that allocation going to investing in political tech that has many follow-on benefits? And I think a lot of investors find that very satisfactory versus just one perspective on a contribution in a singular time.
All right, we have a couple of really interesting questions on Zoom. One person did ask, can you all quickly share your Twitter handles?
Oh yeah, it's just at Hillary Lear.
Okay, yeah. And Lear is Lehr.
At Corey Alpert, CORYALPERT.
And it's just at feel good action.
Okay, Corey, I have to ask, any relation to Herb Alpert?
No, but his daughter and my sister have the same name and their email addresses. One has a period between the two names, one doesn't, so they get emails mixed up all the time.
Oh, wow. Okay. You're like 4 degrees from Janet Jackson. That's huge. Okay, so the question is, talk to us about, and it just disappeared. Where'd it go? Talk to us about SMS. It can be a really effective tool, but it's becoming way more prevalent and honestly getting annoying. I so second this question. with all the fundraising texts that we get every day. Is SMS still working, and how is technology helping to make it smarter, less annoying, and more relational?
Do you want to? You know more. Okay. So I did work at a political texting company for 3 years. So Hustle was the first peer-to-peer texting tool, and I joined their team really early in 2016. We were partnering with the Sanders campaign and the Clinton campaign in the primaries, and seeing what, from then until now, I think there's large saturation of political-based communication. And I think there's a challenge between being a technology provider and a mediator or quality control force. There might be some room for intervention, but I think ultimately it's important for us as campaigns and vendors to co-create some standards that really resituate the use of the tool in relationship building in a way that needs to improve for people to ultimately feel the most positive sentiments they can when they receive all of these texts, right? Which ultimately is what we need in order to build the power that we need to win. And I think that we would benefit from some corrections there. I'd love to highlight some best practices. Another company in our portfolio that joined recently is Community. President Joe Biden just joined the Community platform, and you can actually text him now and get a text back. Stacey Abrams is also on the Community platform, and I think uses it in an absolutely excellent manner. For example, at Thanksgiving, she texts out her sweet potato pie recipe, right? And she texts people happy birthday, right? And that's how you build relationships, right? And so I think when tools are built to encourage those best practices and make it affordable and accessible, and we can use the data properly to have long-term relationships built from one single phone number over time, that's a really positive use case. And I do think there's a role for the technology providers to alter the products to make those best practices more likely.
What I'm hearing definitely is the tools are tools, but the core message still is really the magic. And that's what I think this guest was noticing has been lost, particularly with the most recent raft of SMS messages. Yes, Corey.
Just to add something into that from the kind of disaster relief perspective, I don't know if you remember this. We actually I just found this out like half an hour ago. We actually worked together during the Hurricane Harvey relief because I was at US Conference of Mayors. And so we partnered with the mayor of Houston and built a really cool text platform to get people to volunteer and like how to get to shelters and and Hustle donated all of that texting, and we were supposed to use like the volunteer's name and we lied about that, but we had a woman named Caroline who was texting everyone, and I think that ended up in your like use case report, and we found that very funny. But anyway, like on the disaster relief side, SMS is super important because it's deliverable in places where you don't have 3G or better internet. So like in Ukraine right now, after a city gets bombed, I can't get like digital content to you. I can't get you a website to say, here's where the nearest like clean water is, here's where the nearest shelter is. But I can almost always get a text to you, and within 3 hours I can get a beacon out to your area to make sure that I can get a text to you. And text can actually work on a chain system. So if your phone is within 100 feet of another phone, and then I can like bounce text through that to the next person who's connected to a platform. So all that to say, like especially in disaster relief scenarios, having trust of these text platforms is really important. And I think, just to echo what Hillary's saying, I think we enter some dangerous territory when you look at a text that and you just kind of ignore it, because it can be super important and it can be something really vital. And something that to me is really important is for community organizations in a place that just got hit by a hurricane or a war or anything else to be able to stand these things up really quickly. And it's something that I really love about a focus that HGL has, of like making sure that a city of 10,000 people can have one person in an afternoon be able to turn on at least some version of that to be able to engage with people and do things really smart. Because that access is so important.
There's probably people in this room who know this story better than I do, but in the Damon Santola book, he's a sociologist at Penn, which is called Change, How to Make Big Things Happen. he actually recounts the history of Twitter and about how it languished and it wasn't being adapted. And then it was after a San Francisco earthquake where they had massive adoption. It wasn't in the developing world. It was here after a natural disaster that Twitter took off.
At one point, just like fire chat, so the stuff that's the same technology that there are groups using that like media. Open source mesh net. At one point, actually, you can also get Bluetooth and actually talk on the Bluetooth level for one. Super important to install.
Hold on, got a question in the back.
Okay, you guys have talked a lot about privacy, or you've kind of touched on it. And I actually thought it was really interesting when you, when you brought up the idea of being able to like text somebody across a state line and say, hey, Joanne, I noticed you're not registered to vote. This is important to me. And I thought, gosh, that'd be really like, it would make me question my own privacy. If like my cousin texted me that, I'd be like, how did you know that? You know what it, but I'm going to take this in a different direction. In light of everything that's coming out, especially after the Dobbs case, and how even, our government is telling us like delete period apps and like essentially be careful about what kind of you're doing in your own digital world. How are you responding to that so that people feel comfortable with interacting on these platforms in light of the fact that like we're also learning to not use these platforms at the same time? It just seems like it's a very confusing moment of convergence.
Yeah.
Well, there were a couple of things there, right? Yeah. So on the first one, it is a secret in this country who you voted for, but it's not a secret if you voted. And, that's public record. And so I think one of the huge problems of that is that politicians are basically business people, in a sense, who are identifying their market. They look at who's voting and they go, oh, I got a message to these people. And so everybody who's not voting or who's an infrequent voter is just kind of like not worth my time. And so, I guess this kind of goes, back to you setting up a new society and a democracy about how you arise out of the ashes of a vacuum. But I'm a socialist and I don't want everybody to have total privacy. I want people actually to be on record and I think there are benefits if you're living in a communal society that you can be reached. So I believe in the voting record being public, and I'm trying to reach the people and trying to motivate them who aren't engaged.
Yeah, there's so many different prisms to your question, and I think that they are important for us to all wrestle with, right? Who has access to what data when? I think the publicly available voter file that you can request from Secretary of State for the purposes of political speech is important for making it accessible for people to know that elections are happening and get the information they need to make an informed choice to vote. I don't know if we have people using the principles of organizing in political speech always, right? Sometimes it's just blasting people with information or, many campaigns contacting one person, right? And so it leads to a subpar citizen experience, right? But ultimately it is protected as political speech, as a piece of free speech. And so when we start to think about privacy intersecting with political speech, right, it opens up a number of questions. I think probably the best thing in intermediate period is to default to best practices of organizing and give people positive, rewarding civic experiences so that there are less objections to their information being shared because it's being used in a way that has their best interests very transparently at heart. And I think as much as we can hold the bar on that quality control for those types of communication, the better off we'll be. But there are still those bigger questions, I think, out there that are really interesting to ask. I wish we had more time to talk more there.
Okay, so with that, looking at the time, we've gone over a little bit. We'll take one last question, Ruben. Did you have your? Okay. All right, make it a good one. You're closing us out. No pressure.
I grew up in Europe under several parliamentarian political systems, and the pros and cons to that, but the pros are there are much more ideas that are presented than usually just two. Is there any political tech that is going in the direction of trying to bring people together, just to share ideas and talk policy and avoid politics? Is there anything that can bridge a conservative Democrat with a moderate Republican and say, let's just talk policy and let's exchange some ideas?
There are a couple that come to mind. One is called is it called Lawmaker? Do you know about that? Lawmaker, it's not an HDL company, but you can just propose policy and it's like an open source where people can start working together in groups to try to make, and it's actually, I think, somewhat mature in Kansas City, where they're bringing things forward and putting them in front of, and I think it's called Lawmaker. It's by a couple of people in LA, I think, or maybe they're in Kansas. And the other one to me is an HDL company, and it was up there on the slide as Junto, but I think it's called Chasm now. Chasm with a K. How do you spell it? K-A-Z-M. And it's really just a video conference tool, but it's kind of, there's some benefits to it because their motto is conversation at scale. And I think there's a group that uses it called Living Room Conversations. And they really are trying to invite people with different perspectives into the conversation. One thing I love about the tool is that it tells you how long you've been talking during this conversation. And it in the whole conversation, it also tells you when you're approaching the 2-minute mark and suggests that maybe you shut up.
Do you want to add any that you know of, or they're happening in Ukraine?
I mean, Ukraine's like a whole different situation at this point. It's less about like finding political common ground as much as more like making sure people don't die. Not to be glib about it. I mean, I think my perspective on this maybe comes from, I grew up in rural South Carolina. Like, I think we just need to get better at having offline conversations. And I know that might be an unpopular opinion in a tech panel that I wasn't invited to speak at. But, and thank you both. But, you know, I think sometimes we shy away from having a conversation with someone that we disagree with, regardless of the platform that we're on. And to me, the solution isn't necessarily building like a whole new platform to have a conversation with someone who's clearly coming to that platform to have a conversation. But like when someone responds to your Instagram story with like, I disagree with you. I mean, in some situations, like, yes, it's okay to say, okay, go fuck yourself. Like, yes, women should have abortions and they should have them wherever and whenever they'd like. Like there are certain things that are just simply not up for debate, but like we shy away from having conversations that are just difficult and hard and are with people with whom we don't share perspective. And I'd be curious, like, are there places, is there tech that like helps us learn how to have those conversations? Because to me, that's the crux. Not like, is there this other group of people who like want to have conversations and others in like, who also want to have these conversations? Because I think that is easy enough to find. But where does someone go who like wants to just learn how to have that conversation with their conservative or liberal or libertarian or whatever else neighbors or friends or people they went to high school with?
Start with Deborah Tannen.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Communication. Difficult conversation.
Deborah Tannen.
look at what's happening around Dow, governance, and this question that experience playing the wars before they vote on it, and that enforces smart contract. This, so I think it's happening. I'll be very frank. They literally think I think that, especially when I was in this, what kind of
So not the up note I was hoping for, but no, the mix, not the up note, but that's okay. Can we please give a round of applause to our guests? Special guests, Corey and Andy with Feel Good Action. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate. Oh, one moment, please. Whenever Tish speaks, she's the E.F. Hutton of 2022. We listen.
You know, I do a lot of phone banking with Swing Left, and part of it is, and there is a thing about how to learn to speak to people that disagree with you, because you will end up talking to a lot of people who disagree with you. And it's those conversations that are really important. So I do believe that, along with the old style knocking on doors, but the phone banking is an effective tool, along with the digital, et cetera, to really reach people and have conversations with. So I encourage you to do some of that.
Thank you, Tisha. So thank you all again for coming to Manny's.
Thank
Just a
you.
couple of things before we let you go. Tisha and Briz in the back are great examples of people who help keep Manny's open and keep our ticket prices low and the lights on. They are members of our sponsor community, and they have been the backbone of this space. And we couldn't do our work, which is not just in the space, but actually setting up victory booths in 2020, gearing up for our activism fair, which is coming up at the end of this month, as well as our drag democracy extravaganza happy hour. We're figuring out the name. We're going to use all the cliche phrases. That's on the 30th. If you are interested and want to support programming like this and more, please feel free to see me or just reach out. You can find out more information on our website. And with regard to events, we have everything pretty much posted online, welcometomannys.com. If you are sharing, we want you to share this on your social media. We're Welcome to Manny's on all the platforms. Wednesday, we are really excited. We have the governor of Colorado, Jared Polis, want to make sure I pronounce it correctly, will be joining us. He is doing well and thriving in Colorado. And he also happens to be the first openly gay governor in the history of our country. So, if you want to talk to someone who can work and build and make things happen under pressure, he's the guy to see. So he will be with us on Wednesday. Beyond that, Thursday, we have Gen Z change makers. We have a lot of events happening here, guys. And this time next week, we're bringing our monthly old school town hall back. If you are a parent of an SFUSD student, the neighbor of an SFUSD student, or you've just been following the news and you remember the hot mess that was SFUSD, we have a new superintendent and he is coming here to talk to you. So bring your questions, bring your neighbors. Let's find out what his game plan is. And then my final highlight, I think this one's going to be hilarious. You all may remember a few months ago hearing about these $17,000 or $30,000 trash cans that San Francisco invested in. Well, they are bringing those here on Tuesday. There will be prototypes, there will be videos, there will be mock-ups, because DPW does want to hear from you. So make sure you are there. I know that's going to be hilarious.